If you're not spending a big chunk of your personal time thinking about the future, why on earth would anybody else in your company do that?
Welcome to this week's Escape Your Limits podcast. Today we're speaking with a premier expert on innovation and growth strategies during times of uncertainty. The interview reveals how business leaders can anticipate and exploit disruptive inflection points before they happen. The pivotal changes taking place in business environments today are a wake-up call for leaders to not only define their cultural values, but to be able to understand how to stay ahead of the game. So to talk about our recent book, Seeing Around Corners, please welcome Professor at Columbia Business School and one of the world's top business thinkers, Rita McGrath, to the Escape Your Limits podcast.
Well, when I first started my PhD, which was in management, and I had been a manager for about 8 years, and I thought, oh, I must know a thing or two about management. Wrong. And so when I first started, it was an awful year. And, I didn't know how to read an academic article. I didn't know what a theory was. I didn't know how to function. And I thought, this is just never going to be me. But I'd made my choice, so I persevered. And through a lot of hard work and a lot of support from some people that really cared, got past that and have really enjoyed a thriving life in academia. But it sure didn't start out that way.
Thank you for supporting the Escape Your Limits podcast. If you're thinking about creating a unique and engaging fitness space to take your fitness to the next level, then we have you covered. Escape Fitness design and manufacture some of the most innovative, attractive, and durable functional training and free weight equipment used by many of the best trainers and fitness brands across the globe. As a valued listener, we are offering you a 10% discount off many of the products on our website. You can check out the full range by going to escapefitness.com and use the code DUMBBELL. That's escapefitness.com using the code DUMBBELL. That's it for me. Please enjoy the rest of this interview. So Rita, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today. I saw your book and said to our team, I said, well, look, this is a very interesting subject at the moment to talk about. And so I wonder when, I believe you wrote the book in 2019, or it came out in 2019. So I wonder whether, being an expert in seeing around corners, whether you'd anticipated anything like this happening.
Well, I don't think anyone really anticipated the COVID-19 threat, specifically the way it unfolded. Although if you look at the backstory, there was plenty of evidence that, warning that something like this could happen. And, one of the unfortunate things about human cognition and human behavior is when you put in place measures that prevent something terrible from happening, a lot of people's reaction is, oh, see, that was overblown. You overreacted. We wasted all that money on something that wasn't a big deal. So if you think about it, SARS, AIDS, Ebola, we're all addressed and relatively well contained. And so people sort of, oh, well, this isn't a big deal. And yet along comes a pandemic, which I would argue has many similarities to those. And we didn't have preparedness in place, and the results have been catastrophic.
Yeah, I heard you on an interview talk about it, where you mentioned that, I think it was the US government, if I'm correct, sort of were informed or warned about these things, and that they just decided to kind of dismiss it as something that was not going to happen. Obviously, that was quite a fatal error in retrospect. But is that common then? These sort of obvious signals that whether it's businesses or country leaders are given, and yet we sort of fail to sort of take action on some of those signals, would you say?
Oh, it happens all the time. And I think there are a couple of fundamental reasons why. The first is that we tend to confuse our preferences with our predictions. And so we get very fixated on the outcomes we'd prefer to have happen. And then when someone, in the organization or even a critic outside says, hang on, these other things are also possible, we just don't even want to take them in. So I think that's the first issue. The second is that we confuse the outcome of a particular warning in terms of preparation versus prediction. And my argument is it's almost impossible to predict because there are just so many variables that could, have an impact. I mean, who would have predicted this time last year that we would have this kind of ongoing struggle with the pandemic? However, you can prepare. And this is where I think a lot of the techniques in the book become kind of useful, because if you can broaden the range of outcomes you're prepared to consider, you're much more likely to be ready earlier than if you wait until the thing's upon you and all of a sudden, well, it wasn't what I wanted, but now it's here.
Right, right. So if we use what's happening at the moment in the world, like many of the people who listen to this are in the health and wellness space. So if you take the approach of being able to see around corners, nobody knew that this was going to happen. Certainly if you had a chain of fitness clubs, or if you're manufacturing equipment, that sort of thing, how then would is something like this? Is it just not possible to have seen this around corners, or could you say, well, look, maybe there's going to be certain changes that could impact our industry, and we need to be maybe keep an eye on some of those things? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, as I said, the Bill Gates's 2015 TED Talk, which is now famous, was talking about how we need to be prepared for pandemics the same way we would be prepared for a military situation, or a natural disaster. And we know that most of the success of those efforts comes from the planning and preparation in advance. You're going to summon any amount of energy to react in the moment, but if you haven't laid the groundwork ahead of time, it's not going to be so effective. With respect to the industry, it's a fascinating industry. I mean, there was a lot of evidence that it wasn't in. I'll just take the fitness industry as a case in point. It wasn't in super robust health before. I mean, you had the big chains that were struggling. You had, the smaller boutique folks doing better, but they're not scaling. There were a lot of kind of industry level or sector level challenges already long before the pandemic. Coming out of the pandemic, I actually see huge opportunities, because one of the things that has really come to the fore is the importance of physical and mental health. And I think it's now become a discussable thing. I think corporations are certainly much more willing to bring it into the workplace than they ever have been. And I think certainly when I talk to HR leaders, the question of, are people physically, are they mentally well, has become really a hot button, top of the agenda item. So I think that's really important. The other thing I think that's beginning to become clear is that people are engaging with fitness in all kinds of different ways. So, you can't buy a set of dumbbells, to have at home. People can't keep them in stock. So this notion that there's now a continuum of ways you can engage with being physically fit, all the way from, a traditional gym type experience, which has been modified to make it safe, but all the way through, outdoor adventures, peer-to-peer led adventures, apps, remote training. And I think it's just creating a lot more ways in which fitness professionals, health professionals can engage with their users.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting time, because there's obviously the pandemic, but then also what we're seeing for, I guess, businesses that are in the traditional bricks and mortar space. They're seeing competition from people like Apple that are now, coming out with, their very, very low price fitness apps, and people like Peloton and sort of many others. And I know in your book you talk about sort of, which is quite interesting. Maybe we could talk about this. Is arenas versus industries, because I think and I think you sort of say something like, when some of these new players come into the space, they're not defined by any of the rules that other people play by, or that people within the industry feel as though you need to play by. So how do you sort of I suppose rethink and I guess sort of think out? Well, two questions. What do you mean by arenas, and then how do you sort of probably reclassify yourself to be part of maybe a bigger opportunity?
So the concept of an arena is a departure from the traditional preoccupation and strategy that we have with industry. And if you think about it, the academic field of strategy came from what was called industrial organization economics. And by definition, those people presume that an industry exists, that sets of transactions have already been established, that pricing is already there, and. And so they really don't look at cases where there's a whole new kind of opportunity opening up, or a whole new kind of market, or a whole new kind of service. They don't really look at that. So I really wanted to sort of take a departure from that and say, actually, no, the arena concept means that there are stakeholders. You can think of them as customers or clients or your necessary suppliers or whatever. And each of those stakeholders have jobs that they're trying to get done in their lives. And so that's a concept that was developed by Tony Ulwick and Clayton Christensen. And they say, don't think about selling products and services. Think about your customers or your users hiring you to get jobs done in their lives. And when you think about it that way, it really reframes your view of who your competition is and what the nature of your competitive environment is. So just to take an example that will be familiar to everyone, Netflix has been very blunt in saying, our arena is your disposable time. So anything that you would spend your disposable time on that doesn't involve being glued to a Netflix screen is competition to us. So it could be a glass of wine, it could be going to the gym, it could be taking a walk, it could be, anything that takes disposable time. And that's an example of arena thinking. Now, I personally think that's a little creepy, but they've been very public about it. That's what they're doing. So when it comes to why inflection points make such a difference and why you want to be more open-minded about looking for opportunities, what an inflection point does is it makes some things possible that were never possible before, and it makes some things more difficult or less desirable than they were before. So if you think about an experience, let's just take someone who goes to a gym, is having, we have all these really well understood patterns, right? So gym memberships skyrocket in January, but by March, everybody's back to whatever they were doing before. Gym owners actually have, calculations that they make about how many memberships can I sell relative to the people actually turning up in the facility. And but if you think about it, there are a lot of underexplored negatives in that experience. So why is there the drop off in March? Why don't people want to come back? Why, what is it about the experience that, allows them to say to themselves at the end of the day, no, I'm too tired. No, I'm too hungry. No, my kids need me. No, I've got other things I need to do with my time. And if we really dug into how to eliminate those negatives, right, you could envision a completely different kind of experience. So just to continue with the analogy, the job I want to get done as a gym goer, right, is I want to feel better. I want to feel fit. I want to maybe fit into last year's jeans, whatever my motivation is for doing that. And gym owners have a very limited way often that they look at that job. It's okay, you're going to come to the gym X days a week and we're going to maybe assign you a trainer and this is your routine. And it's a very narrow slice of getting that full job done, right? Whereas if you rethought it and you said, our job is not just to provide you with a physical facility and a robust, sensible training pattern. Our job is to get you into last year's jeans. That's going to require a whole lot of other things, right? That's going to require maybe some subtle reminders, maybe some behavioral nudges, maybe a sympathetic, hey, didn't make it to the gym. Look, let's just take 5 minutes, a text message on your phone, take 5 minutes. Your coach is right here. I'm just going to take you through some stretching so you don't wake up sore tomorrow, But it's sort of an engagement philosophy almost that aligns what you're offering with what the consumer is buying. And I'm not saying this is a right or a wrong way, but I'm just using it to illustrate. So if you went to market with a premise that said, we're not just here to be a gym, we're here to help you accomplish your goals. And that could involve mental health. It could involve nutrition. It could involve, yes, indeed, physical movement. It could involve a whole number of things. And yet I find with most gym owners and most people in whatever their profession is, they're experts on their profession. So I know exactly, if you come to me and you say, I've got a sore calf, I know exactly the kind of stretches and what I would propose and how this connects to that. And you're very, very steeped in your expertise. Whereas the customer is steeped in their experience and they know what outcome they want to drive. What they just don't know is what the best way is to get there.
You mentioned hostages hostages and not customers, which I like, and I can kind of see how that rings true. And I guess that connects a little bit to one of your other books about the competitive advantage. I've not got the name of it now, but how the fact that competitive advantages now are extremely short windows. And do you think that that mentality of almost saying, well, look, we've got this great competitive advantage, and almost sort of feeling as though you're the market leader, almost like assuming that yes, we have got these customers, and that leads you into this sort of false sense of security. Do you see that? Is that a common thing for businesses to connect one of your previous books in terms of, look, we've got this market position, we are the market leader, it's going to be very difficult for someone to get us, and as such, those people are kind of our hostages. Is that a sort of business psyche that you see?
Absolutely. And it's very common. It's very common. So there's a couple of things that are contributors to that phenomenon. So the first thing is that a new kind of business, and let's just take your modern smartphone versus a BlackBerry, just to take an example. BlackBerry's derivation was from the world of pagers, and it was all about business communication with the buttons, and you got your thumbs ready, and you did the BlackBerry prayer. And BlackBerry honestly believed right up until about 2012 that it owned the business market, and it did. And it did. And this is something I think that people often forget. The first version or two of the iPhone was a consumer delight. People loved it. I mean, people waited all night in the rain to get their hands on one, right? But it wasn't a business tool at that point. The security wasn't good enough, at least here in the US. It was only offered on the weakest carrier that first 2 years. So it wasn't a business tool. So the BlackBerry people looked at it and they said, first of all, this thing is a consumer. It came out of Apple's, music and design specifications, right? The BlackBerry came from pagers. The iPhone came from the iPod, which in turn came from Apple's digital hub strategy, which had to do with enabling and empowering our digital lives and doing so in a way that was really compelling. So they had sort of two different hierarchies, if you will. And when the BlackBerry people first looked at the iPhone, they were like, oh, lovely, it's going to expand choice for consumers. They didn't really think about, well, wait a minute, is the development of this thing just going to stop there? Of course not. There's always the next iteration and the next iteration. And Apple was very smart in how they got into the market. At least I'll describe the US experience. They originally started to negotiate with all the carriers. All the carriers wanted a really hard bargain in terms of how much they would give Apple. The weakest carrier, which was AT&T at the time, and I say weakest, by that I mean the worst signal, the least market penetration, the least kind of buzz on the street, as opposed to, say, a Verizon, which was widely regarded to have the best network and the best connectivity and everything like that. And Apple basically said, okay, you give us what we want in terms of how our product is presented to the public, and we will go exclusive with you for 2 years. And so for AT&T, this was phenomenal, right? This incredible differentiator. And if you go back and look at the subscriber numbers, there were tens of millions of people who would never have looked at AT&T if it was sort of on a par with other networks, but because it had the iPhone, they converted over. Now, a lot of them left, right? And this is back to this notion of transient advantage. Once all carriers could carry the iPhone, well, a lot of them weren't loyal. Some of them were, but by that time, the whole market had changed and the whole market dynamic had changed. And so you're kind of looking at these moves and counter moves. So back to your question of incumbents. If you look at any sector, who were the incumbents in mainframes? Well, clearly IBM. They were also a very big player in PCs, but they didn't make any money on PCs because they made them out of off-the-shelf components. Dell at one point was the big dog, and on and on and on. So you can take almost any sector and look at the companies that were at one point, extremely dominant, and show how the mindset of being that dominant sort of got them lulled into a false sense of security. The other thing that I think, and this goes back to the heritage part, is in many cases, getting onto the next advantage is going to require you to develop really new skills, new capabilities, new muscles, as it were. And for a lot of incumbent executives for whom that position is the culmination of years of striving and effort, that looks unattractive. All of a sudden, my library, my connections, my knowledge of how things work is not relevant because some new thing has come along and replaced it.
Yeah. You mentioned that most firms struggle to grow successfully over time then? Would you say that's one of the big reasons? Like if you look at BlackBerry, I agree. The BlackBerry phone was a fantastic business phone. And as much as I love the iPhone now, it was really difficult to move away from it for quite a long time. And you almost sort of think, well, and I suppose you could argue the same with someone like Nokia as well, that had a brilliant phone for just calling. It was durable, it didn't break. iPhones are terrible for breaking. But what do you think those in that case then? They must have had some extremely smart people in the all the best talent that you could get then. Why do you think these sort of big companies struggle to have that consistency over time? And are there a couple of things that you think that people or businesses that have that consistently are doing differently?
Oh, absolutely. So I can tell you Nokia, because I was an observer to this slow collapse over many years. So I'd done a ton of work with Nokia in the 1999-2000 period, where they were really very dominant players in their sectors. And they had constructed at that time what was a really interesting balance between the new businesses and the existing business, and had what I consider to be a very fruitful interchange between the two. And you had a leadership transition in which people came in who really hadn't been through that sort of emergence, that balancing part of Nokia. And they saw unlimited profit potential. And they said, okay, what's going to make us successful is our ability to just turn out, hundreds of thousands of phones per minute, that kind of thing. And we're going to be able to penetrate into, the less developed market and this and that and the other thing. And they also made a bunch of very bad technology choices in terms of the ecosystem and the operating system and that kind of thing. But without geeking out about it too much, essentially the focus of the company went from customer focus, really understanding what it is customers wanted to get done, and move toward really greater profitability. So as an example, in about 2006, so before this all fell apart, I got a note from one of my colleagues in the company who had been working at their research labs. And he said, they've forgotten all that we learned. They've turned their back on venturing. They're running the venture unit now for an ROI. And people like me aren't going to survive, so we're all leaving. And it was that kind of decision making. So I think when a company that has everything to lose loses it, it's because they've allowed the balance to shift too much towards today, and they haven't allowed tomorrow to speak with as loud a voice. That would be one. So some companies that manage to do this well, and there are a whole variety of them. So Unilever comes to mind, the German company Bosch. To take some European examples, Klockner, which is a metals company, which has just done an amazing digital transformation. I think they're great. Here in the US, I think Best Buy, which went from being, a showroom for large, powerful tech companies to now actually taking Amazon on and winning in some cases. So what you see in those companies is a clarity of focus around what is the arena that we're trying to compete in, and how do we best serve the constituents in that arena? And they don't take a backseat to that. So at Best Buy, just to take an example, Hubert Joly, who was the CEO during the midst of this transition, said, wait a minute, what customers don't want is a 42-inch wide television. They think they want that, but what they actually want is that television on the wall, programmed so that it can pick up internet signals with a remote control that my wife can understand, with the channels that we've subscribed for showing up reliably in a way that and so what he realized is that what he could do that no e-commerce player could do was offer that wise, consistent advice. And if you go into a Best Buy store even today and you say, here's my problem that involves something involving technology, you will get a ton of advice, a ton of sort of carefully considered. And I go in there and they don't want to sell me the most expensive thing because they're not getting paid on commission. They're getting, they're getting paid to give the customer a fantastic experience. And I think that mindset of let's keep focused on what that customer's end state is so valuable and has really been a very consistent theme when I look at companies that are able to transition through these waves of competitive advantage.
You mention in the book as an example where you say snow melts from, is it around the edges or from the edges? Is that how you describe it? And which essentially, I guess, for those who are listening, means it's the outside. It's not the people at the top of the business, really. It's the people on the fringes that have this information. One of the things I've always been curious on about innovation is that some things that are innovative, you kind of think, well, were the consumers actually asking for certain things? So, you probably there's been tons of articles saying, well, was anyone really asking for the iPhone when they came out with that? In some of the examples that you've said where these companies have continued to evolve and stay in touch with the customers, what do you think they've done as it relates to that example that you give? How do you think they're getting this feedback from their businesses to make those decisions, and I guess to predict what's likely to happen down the road? Because some of the changes seem to happen extremely quickly. What's your sort of experience on that?
Well, I think the first principle is that companies that are able to pick up on these weak signals do tend to have really good intelligence systems, where something odd or unusual or different that happens out in the fringes someplace has a way of making its way back to the decision-making elements in a firm. And just as an example, one of the things that at Apple, and Apple's not a technology company, right? They are, depending on how you define it, but they don't invent stuff, right? And one of the folks came to the leadership team at Apple and said, companies like Corning are inventing these incredible substances that can allow human beings to sort of connect with a user interface in a way that's never been done before. And not to get too detailed on it, but the iPad was actually invented before the iPhone. And they were looking for a way that you could avoid using a stylus, that you could just communicate with the technology with your finger. And it was that advanced technology coupled with this hunger that they had for how do human beings want to relate to technology that led to this, wait a minute, if we use this new stuff in this way, here's a user goal that we can accomplish. So I think the first thing you want to think about is, do I have ways of keeping in touch with new technologies or new ways of working or new breakthroughs that could allow me to do something really better or different for customers? I think the other thing that innovative companies often do is they don't sort of see things as they are. They're always looking for places where the customer job is not getting done or the need is really not getting met in a satisfying way. And so they're looking for workarounds. They're looking for, what are the use cases? So, a very innovative company that I've mentioned in a couple of my previous books is just based out of Cambridge in the UK. And they'll talk about going and looking at how customers actually use products. And let's take something really basic like a coffee maker. And when you look at how people actually use it, what you see is uses that the manufacturer never even dreamed of. So people will brew coffee twice to make it stronger. They'll use flavored water to give it a different flavor. They'll use beans of a different type. They'll do all this stuff with this common or garden thing, not because they're intending to, make some giant innovation happen, but because that's how it suits them and they prefer that. And I think when you think about most consumer products, there are always things that are less satisfying, right? And if you just take your phone, right? What are all the things you no longer have to carry around because the phone does it all, right? It's a flashlight, it's it's a timer, it's a stopwatch, it's a camera, it's a video camera, it's and just on and on. Every single app on that phone replaces something that used to be done by something else, and yet here it is. It's cheap, it's convenient, you always have it with you, and you don't have to drag all that other stuff around. And so I think those kinds of ahas are extremely interesting when you think about how they might make a difference to ordinary people's lives.
You talk about not focusing too much on the competition and looking more at your customers. Do you mean, when you say that, do you mean like exclusively? It's like almost, look, probably what your competitors are doing may not be right. So spending a lot of time doing competitive analysis, etc., is probably taking you down the wrong road. Or do you balance that? What's your thoughts on sort of studying the competition as opposed to just spending that time with people that are using and interacting with your product?
Yeah, so I think I mean, I don't advocate ignoring your competition. I don't think that's smart. I do think, keeping an eye on them is useful, but I think it's also important to remember there's always three kinds of competitor that could show up on your radar. So the first kind of competitor is obvious. That this is people who make something similar to what you make, and that's well understood by customers. So Unilever makes soap and Procter and Gamble makes soap. And, we have all these battles in the grocery market aisles about my soap is better than your soap because blah, 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 blah. And of course, you got to engage in that kind of competition by the time you're in a mass consumer packaged goods kind of market. So that's your traditional competition. Your second kind of competition is your emergent or disruptive competition. So these are the ones that are sort of creeping into your market, often in a category that doesn't really appeal to you or with a consumer set that doesn't really matter to you. So a great example of this would be how Progressive in the United States got into automobile insurance. And what they realized was that every other car insurance company was going for what they call the standard driver. So that's probably me anyway. I don't know about your driving habits, but these are people who, commute to work, park their car, not a lot of accidents. But then there was this group of about 15% of what they called non-standard drivers. And so these are people who have a lot of accidents, rent cars a lot, beat them up, very erratic road behavior. And Progressive said, well, interestingly, regular insurance companies, A, don't want to serve these people, and B, if they do, they charge them an arm and a leg. So we could charge a teeny bit less than that, and we could pick up this whole market. And that's where they started. And they drove a series of innovations. And this is fascinating to me, that actually appealed to that particular segment uniquely. So they were one of the ones that pioneered the on-site claim review. So if you do get into an accident, and remember, we're talking non-standard drivers, so they have more accidents than standard drivers. And what Progressive said was, what we're going to do is we know statistically by looking at big data, we know where these accidents are highly likely to happen. So we'll park, a claims adjuster in a mobile van at 45th and 5th Avenue. And, and then when an accident occurs somewhere in that area, because we statistically know that one will, and it's one of our people, we drive over, we have an automated fax machine, we take all the pictures, we arrange to have a loaner car delivered there. In other words, they create this irresistibly efficient experience for that particular customer segment that other people can't beat. And of course, they grow beyond that. I mean, they didn't want to stay with non-standard drivers, but that was their wedge into what has today become a very broad-based market. And then you have what I call the oblique competitors. And this connects the idea of arenas to who your competitive set is. And the reason it's so misleading sometimes to focus just on your traditional competitors is this is what causes you to miss the Netflixes of the world, or the things that influence your consumers' behavior, but that aren't direct competitors with yours. And most businesses have infinite numbers of oblique competitors, and so we need to be thinking more about those. Lastly, I'll say, when you ask the question, how do you center a business? And there are several different ways of doing it, right? The most obvious one is on customers. So, Amazon very famously says it wants to be the most customer-centric business on the planet. That's what their goal is. But there's also other ways. So you might center a business around expertise. So if you look at the large, say, consultancies, right? Customers may not think that they're being surrounded with love and warmth, but they think they are getting the top brains on the planet on a problem that matters to them. And so they'll put up with, whatever it is the negatives are. You might center a business on technologies. So Corning Glass, for example, has as its corporate strategy, we want to be about 10 years ahead of the bulk of our customers. And so that means we need to give free rein to the scientists, to the engineers, to the people who are going to be really moving those technologies to the next level. And so there are a number of different ways you can actually center a company, and certainly don't lose track of your customer. Of course not, but understand how that connection to the customer is going to be expressed in your particular case.
Yeah, well, after reading and listening to some of your stuff, it did make me rethink about that, because I guess a lot of times, particularly sales teams, it's always, well, look, this is what they're doing, and you within industries, I suppose, when you think about industries as opposed to arenas, it's very easy to, you go to trade shows and you see what everybody else is doing, and you kind of get this incestuous type of, well, everybody's doing what everybody else is doing. But I guess when you look at, there was a great example that you talked about with the Dollar Shave Club and how that sort of basically, took some massive companies, put them on the floor for a period of time. And I guess nobody would have expected that direct to consumer thing coming into those sort of fast moving consumer goods businesses. It wasn't something I guess a lot of these people obviously predicted to happen. So how I guess one thing, I suppose it's great to probably not spend too much of your time just getting too concerned about that. But how do you think then some certain companies can look at the indicators to have predicted something like that shift happening? Were there several signs already that like a Procter and Gamble probably missed when someone like this little guy, Dollar Shaving Club, came putting stuff out on YouTube, do you think?
Well, I think that existing successful entities look at the world through the lens of what's possible that made their success. So if you think about the Gillette business model, right, we invest in R&D that allows us to create better products, that we use our armies of distributors to get them into retail channels, which was the most efficient way to get to consumers for many, many decades. This direct-to-consumer thing was only made possible very recently. And then undergirding the whole thing is hundreds of millions of dollars of mass market advertising to build brand and maintain credibility. And if that's the lens through which you're looking at the world, first of all, you tend not to see the negatives in that experience you created. And secondly, you tend not to see how that approach is no longer, it's no longer the only way to do things. So if I go back to the whole question of e-commerce, and if you think about e-commerce, it's been a really long time in coming. So the first e-commerce sort of businesses really got going in the mid-90s. Amazon, I think 1995 is when they shipped their first book. And what happened, and this is fascinating with inflection points, because you often see this, something will come along that creates a new possibility and everybody goes nuts, right? It's like, oh my God, this is the next big thing. We've got to move on this immediately. So today, I'm looking at you, autonomous vehicles. I'm looking at you, battery operated whatevers. And so everybody pours money into this thing, right? But in the beginning, it's very incomplete. I mean, if you think about the 90s and how you even got on the internet, you plugged it into a phone line. It went, you had a modem, right? It took 5 minutes for a web page to load. Nobody knew how to pay for things. We didn't have PayPal. We didn't have secure transactions. I mean, and. So the ecosystem in those early stages of something that's new is very fragile, very incomplete. And then what usually happens is this kind of bubble, some kind of pop, and everybody goes, see, I told you that wasn't a good idea. That's never going to be anything. Meanwhile, out of the ashes of that initial enthusiasm, and this is very related to Gartner's hype cycle, right? Out of the ashes of that initial enthusiasm come a few players who actually show the way. Right. And they show the way that this is possible. This can be done. So if you think about the direct to consumer market, a really strong early warning would have been Rent the Runway. And Rent the Runway was founded on an idea. Well, the original idea was that wouldn't it be great if we offered designers the capability to rent their creations rather than sell them? And so the founders of Rent the Runway, who were Harvard business students, went to these designers and said, wouldn't this be a great option to offer your customers? And the designers were like, no, we want to sell clothing at the peak of the season to our customers. And so the Rent the Runway people went, well, hang on, we know from customers they'd love to have that option. Why don't we start that? Now, what had to be true for Rent the Runway to become possible? People had to have broadband. People had to be able to pay for things. You had to have a way of reaching customers with the goods and having them returned again, right? And so they systematically broke through all the different requirements for what would make a business like that possible. Now, Dollar Shave Club was years later. And what Dollar Shave Club realized was that for a significant proportion of men, the experience Gillette had designed was very unsatisfying. The razors are expensive by design. They're locked up in these razor fortresses. So I have to go to this retail store and beg somebody to unlock the thing for me. And. It was, in many ways, the blades are great, but the whole experience around them was awful. And that's what allowed Dollar Shave Club to really hone in on that. So incumbents often overlook that. I mean, if you think about Gillette, right, there are probably several thousand people at that company whose day job, right, is to make sure that the Gillette brand, the Mach 3, is positioned right here on the supermarket shelf, and that the Venus razor is right there, and this is positioned exactly where we've paid our retail outlets to put them in, and they're so entrenched with the world as it is and what they need to do to be successful in that world, that opening your eyes to some other world, that seems really weird.
It sounds it sounds as though it's quite an art or a skill to predict it. Like we've had a business, we've been going 20 years. We're a small business, and we're always looking at some new innovations. But I guess it's you mentioned a lot of things have to come together, and I suppose for the Dollar Shave Club, they in some ways a lot of things came together at the right time, my guess, to be able to make that happen. And I suppose for everyone that's successful, there's probably lots that do miss it. For businesses that are small to medium size, is there any guidance you can give about innovation? Because certainly from our side, it's innovation's expensive. Launching the product is expensive because you're trying to you're trying to explain somebody something that they've probably not seen or done before. When it's new, generally, because it's new, there's always stuff that's going to go wrong compared to a product that's been in the market for a while. And then I suppose if you don't have the sort of backing, so, like Gillette obviously have got that muscle behind them where they can quickly say, well, look, that's a great idea. We can potentially do that ourselves maybe and create a brand. Are you sort of coming up with an idea too soon and then sort of just letting somebody say, well, look, we'll take that and we're going to do it themselves? So what advice have you got for the sort of more of the small to medium size as it relates to that innovation and avoiding some of those dangers or risks?
I think the smartest small to medium-sized business innovations come when people are pursuing an innovation that solves a problem they personally have. So if I were to take the creation of Square, the payments platform, it came about because one of their co-founders, who's coincidentally a glass blower, had this really ugly piece of glass he was trying to unload and was absolutely thrilled that this customer was prepared to buy this thing from him, which he didn't like to begin with. But the only way she could pay for it was through American Express. And it had some fascinating backstory about her husband didn't monitor her American Express card, so she could buy this ugly piece of glass, whereas if she paid for it any other way, he would have known about it. And. But the result was that this small merchant, the small glassblower, couldn't take a credit card payment. And he said, and he looked at his phone and he went, hang on, this thing does all kinds of stuff. It's a camera, it's a voice recorder, it's a phone, it's a data store, it's all this stuff. Why can't it be a credit card? And it grew out of a problem that he realized many, in the millions of small artisans, merchants, people just were priced out of being able to access that whole universe of being able to accept credit cards. So Square made that possible. And so I'm sure you've dealt with merchants now. They just pop the thing on their phone and it behaves just like a credit card. And so I think finding something that you authentically know is a problem because someone, either yourself or someone really close to you, has experienced it, and then really thinking about what the solution to that problem needs to look like. So let's take a completely different sector. I'll pick on healthcare. And there's a fantastic company in New York called Flatiron Health. It was founded by two still very young men who came out of the Wharton School, my alma mater, did the entrepreneurship program there, sold their first business to Google for something like $92 million, and then went looking for another problem to solve. And one of their relatives had a case of juvenile cancer. And the father was looking at these two guys and saying, hey, you're data people. Like, why can't I not find information about what the best therapies are, what the most effective treatment centers are, or even how many people have this disease or whatever. And what they realized, the problem they realized, was that all this data was locked up in individual oncologists' offices, and it was impossible to share it. And if you couldn't share it, right, you couldn't see the larger patterns. So just earlier today, I was talking to Tim Harford, who's the author of this fabulous book called The Data Detective, in which he basically defends the statistics profession against its detractors. And he says, there are certain kinds of problems that you cannot solve if you only have individual isolated cases. So these two co-founders of Flatiron Health said, what do we have to do to get that data in one place? And what they basically did was they invented office systems that were absolutely perfect for busy oncologists' offices, gave them away for free, and the exchange, the quid pro quo was, we get to collect anonymously the data that come out of these things. And now for the first time, you're starting to see major data sets for the kinds of cancers that they deal with, to the point where I think the business got sold to Roche for, I think it was $3 billion a few years later, because having that aggregated data was so valuable. But I want to come back to this personal theme, because if they had not had that very personal, very, tragic moment in their personal lives, nothing else would have happened. So, where I think a lot of entrepreneurs go wrong is they make up in their heads some problem they think a customer has, or that they think is probably an issue. And then they go chase that without really validating it first.
And in order to then ensure that the good ideas are able to maintain, because I think I'm correct in, I think you did, was in terms of the Dollar Shave Club, did they have difficulties when the business tried to float? Was it difficult for them to sort of get that support when they went from sort of like a small company? I'm not sure if I got my facts correct, but did you say that was a challenge to them when they tried to get further investment as they matured?
Well, not really. They were venture-backed, modestly, by today's standards,
Right.
Modestly venture-backed. But then the company was seen by Unilever as a chance to re-enter the shaving market. And so Unilever bought them for $1 billion in 2016.
All right. Okay. I think maybe it was a mattress cup. Maybe one of your examples I heard you talking about, maybe some of the mattress.
Yeah, the Casper mattress. Now, that's a fascinating.
Casper mattress. Yeah.
That's a fascinating cautionary tale, because the Casper guys were one of the first in the sort of mattress in a box offerings. And what they were capitalizing on was the fact that most people hate to buy mattresses. It's like right up there with buying a used car in terms of the fun of the experience. You go to a furniture store and this smooth talking salesman comes to you and he's like, so what do you want? What can I sell you? It's a sea of mattresses. It's just unpleasant, right? And so what Casper did was they're trying to peel off this certain group of dissatisfied customers, and they're like, hey, we'll send it to you, we'll show you how to open it up, you get to keep it for 100 days. If you don't like it, call us and we'll come pick it up and we'll refund your money. And for the first little while, it was all sweetness and light and unicorns. They were advertising on the subway, their growth went like this. Well, a couple of years ago I did an analysis of this whole direct to consumer model, right? And the trouble with these businesses is they're really easy to start, but they're also really easy to copy. And so by the time I did this analysis, there were 142 mattress in a box companies because it was so easy. There was nothing defensible about that idea.
So what's the takeaway from that? Like, if they were doing some of the things that you talk about in several of your wonderful books, what because it was a great idea and it certainly moved the needle. They got a big advantage. Could they have looked around a corner, and what would you have said that they could have done in that situation then?
Yeah, so I think what you need to think about is what Jim McKelvey, who's one of the co-founders of Square, he talks about. He calls it an innovation stack. And if you look at companies that have really built through innovation very durable advantages, what you'll see is you don't tend to see this grand plan, the grand vision all the way through. What you see is they set themselves to solving pretty intractable problems, one solution at a time. And I'll pick on Square just because I think this is a great example. Amazon went after Square. They had a business called Local Register, and they had a reader similar to the Square reader, and went after the same market segment, right? Small businesses that couldn't accept credit cards, and they just couldn't get traction. And the reason Amazon, now think about it, they've got all the money they need in the world. They've got incredibly talented, innovative people. You can't think of a smarter company, or arguably one that's better run. So a pretty formidable competitor. But what McKelvey would argue is that because they had solved each of these problems in a unique way, in an idiosyncratically unique way, everything from the envelope that the reader came in, to the size of the reader, to the way that they dealt with merchants, to the way that they handled cash flows, and Amazon couldn't compete. And so when you look at businesses that have created defensible innovations, you tend to see that pattern. The Apple people will tell you, if you talk to the guy that was basically the brains behind the iPod and the iPhone. Well, I'm blanking on his name at the moment, but anyway, if you talk to him, look at his interviews. What he'll tell you is we were solving one scary, difficult problem at a time after another, and that's ultimately what got us to this having something other people couldn't copy. If you take the case of something like a Casper, right? They were a marketing machine. They were brand building, but they didn't manufacture themselves. They didn't have a design advantage. They didn't have anything proprietary. In fact, if you look at those 142 mattress in a box companies, there's about 6 manufacturers who manufacture all those mattresses. They just do it under different brand names with slightly different technologies and whatnot. So there's nothing really protectable at that point.
Yeah, that's a sort of an interesting an interesting lesson, I suppose. With the leadership in these in companies now, and I suppose again going back to your previous book in terms of your competitive window is very, very small. What's required of leadership to be able to sort of drive and lead these companies today versus before? Is it is it just an acceptance that we've got to be continuously looking for that next problem? And so, like, again, just coming back to this Casper, could they, if they were doing this, should it have been it's like, okay, yeah, we've built the brand, we've got the we've got the marketing right now. It's how can we have some proprietary, maybe innovation or manufacturing? But does that sort of conflict with what you've said in terms of, because you also mentioned that the competitive advantage is transient, and so does that mean that you should be investing in your own plant and machinery, or because that sounds like that's quite a permanent commitment and a decision, for example, that maybe that technology then is out of date and you've invested in this big manufacturing. So how do you balance those two, where you want to be like a fast moving company, so you've got to be prepared that maybe that the material that or the manufacturing processes to make that were relevant today, but maybe tomorrow there's going to be something new? Or is that just something that you have to deal with as a business leader?
Well, a couple of things I think are relevant here. I'm not saying you should be vertically integrated under all circumstances. That's one of those sometimes yes and sometimes no. And Apple does most of its manufacturing in China, but they have really strong control over the user experience and how that's expressed in the hardware. So I think a couple of observations about leadership. So the first thing I always look for is what's on your agenda. If you're not spending a big chunk of your personal time thinking about the future, what on earth would anybody else in your company do that? So I look for, 50%, right? On the future, right? So if that's not there, the company's not paying attention to what could be around the next corner. So I look for agenda. Second, I look for curiosity, as in, that was an anomaly. Why did that happen? And curiosity to me goes together with this phenomenon of psychological safety, which is, are people comfortable bringing you disconfirming information? If you have a belief that green is the way to go and somebody says, hang on, there's a big chunk of our customers that are saying they actually prefer blue. Are you open to that? Are you willing to hear that? Because a lot of times as you get more powerful, right, as you get more senior in the company and you're making all the decisions, you start to drink your own Kool-Aid and you start to forget that, you may be in a different hierarchical position, but it doesn't mean you are exposed to more about the reality of the world than anybody else. In fact, you're less exposed to it. So I think agenda, curiosity, psychological safety, and then backing that up with processes in the organization that have a certain discipline to them. So do you have people, time, budget set aside for new things? Are you good about stopping old things, right? If competitive advantages have a life cycle, there are things going into erosion. Do I have the stomach to stop those so that I can pursue those things that are more rewarding and that have bigger upside? So those are some of the things I look for.
One of the things that relates to the fitness industry, with a lot of gyms closed down sort of early part of last year, and many are still closing. So there was there's a big move to digital, people investing in apps, online fitness, and going into an arena where there's Apple and Amazon and everybody else. And I guess in some cases, I use the word DNA. I'm not sure the term but you use, but in some cases, some of these businesses don't naturally have the DNA or the skills in them to become app companies or content businesses. How do you, when you're in a situation where you have got to make a change of course to continue with revenue and evolve your business, how do you do that in a way where you're not overexposing yourself? And how do you decide whether you've got the ability to do it? One, because in our business, we've obviously looked at creating an app. It seems as though it's a logical thing to do. People are working out from home, but within our company, when it's not our strength. We don't have developers and programmers, etc. So do you look and say, well, look, that's something that we're going to have. We need to get into, and we're going to just have to change our change our capabilities to be able to do that? Or do you say, well, look, what's our DNA, and maybe how, is there other ways to do it, or is there other directions to go? How do you sort of help? How do you make those right decisions in your experience?
Well, I think part of it is this Venn diagram, of what is it that you have as unique capabilities, what is it people are willing to pay for, and what is it that's hard for others to copy. And so, out of those things will come a narrow set of opportunities, I suspect, that are appealing to you. Now, when you talk about not having the capabilities to do an app, for example, I think what's helpful there is to draw analogies. So I'll give you an analogy. I'm on the board of McCarter Theater here in Princeton, which is a small, it's not so small. It's a regional theatrical company. And of course, they've been dark almost a year now. And so they're producing a work of art called it's about mental health. It's called, I forget what it's called now, but it's a totally online produced segment where the user goes into this app space and actually creates their own opportunities. And the producer of this thing was talking to us at the board about the difference between launching an in-person show and this digital alternative. And she said, if I think about it, the coders are the same as my set builders, but they're coding in digital language. They're creating a digital space where our set designers in Meat Life would have created a physical space. Our lighting people and our theme people are doing it digitally, whereas in a person it would have been this. And she drew these very nice parallels between what we were doing in the physical space and what could be in the virtual space. So for organizations like yours, I'd be thinking about, well, maybe you don't want to go and be app designers, but a large part of at least what I value in my coaches, and I have a couple of wonderful coaches here in Princeton, what I value about them is the structure and the discipline, the personal relationship, the bits of advice, I've been sitting in front of Zoom all day. I've got a kind of a lower back strain. Can you send me some stuff that might do better? And so it's a digitally intermediated relationship, but it's a relationship. And I think for your kind of business, think about what is it that people value in a relationship. Because I could be on my phone all day long and get like 10,000 apps if I want to, but that's not a relationship. That's just some guy, on a yoga mat doing whatever. So I think what's at the heart and soul of a lot of your business is the trust, the relationship, the human character. And if that's what gets you excited, think about how you can do that, but in a safe way that's mediated perhaps by these other technologies. But I would use the analogies, right? So it's a set designer, but the coder is actually designing the set in a virtual space. And that's the kind of thinking I think we need.
And because we've certainly tried things, and when you do get involved in technology, it seems to take a long time. It seems to be very expensive, and there's always seems the larger companies seem to be moving at such a rapid rate that an idea or a platform or a concept that you built it on may change by the time, or it maybe start to become already dated by the time you get there. What advice have you then got for small companies? Is it better to maybe partner and sort of sit on the top of existing things that are out there and provide your services to that? Or is there anything that you've seen that is a sort of a successful approach to staying ahead of that technology game? Because it sounds like, and you talk about it, it's the technology's kind of moved from where it was to where it's going quite quickly in terms of how we interact with it and what people expect from it, and that seems quite difficult for a relative small to medium sized businesses.
Well, I think smaller companies have the advantage that they tend to be much closer to their customers than large ones are able to be. And they can really see where the customer experience is perturbed or upset in some way. And so I think for a small company, what you want to focus on is what's true for you. So if I take GoDaddy, for example, this is a company that does domain registrations, and there are zillions of companies that do domain registrations. What do I like about GoDaddy? If I call their number, there's actually a human being there. And even if I have to wait, they give me the choice. They say, would you like hold music or would you prefer to wait in silence, right? So if I'm waiting, I can still be doing something productive, and I'm not having to listen to this piano elevator music. Now, that's a trivial thing. It's not a big technology investment, but it's how you're using the technology in a smart way to get the customer, again, that job that they really want to get done. So I wouldn't try to go into an arms race with, Amazon or Google or, any of the big tech players. But I think what you can really hone in on is that personalization of the customer experience.
Yeah, and is in terms of we talked about the leaders, but with the employees, how big a part do they play? I know at the beginning we talked about the snow melting. Is it what are the successful companies doing as it relates to their teams and getting them to be part of the process?
Well, I think what Zeynep Ton would call creating a good jobs environment. So what does that look like? It means you're adequately rewarded, you have some control over your work, you're given opportunities to advance, you're cross-trained, you're seen as a valuable asset who can drive greater customer loyalty rather than, a cog in a wheel. So you're treated like a human being rather than a badly performing robot. So I think that's the first premise. That's the building block, right? And then beyond that, I think giving people a certain amount of headroom and autonomy to make decisions and to move forward. And to be able to do things that delight customers, in a way that doesn't require them to get permission all the time. So, I think a great example of this would be Netflix, which started off as a really tiny company and today is, a global behemoth. But when they got going, Patty McCord and Reed Hastings, who is their founder and chief HR person respectively, said, what we want? We want higher talent density than any other company. And they created an entire HR structure around this. We want the top 10% of talent in any category that works for us. And they just flipped the whole people equation on its heads. And they basically do things like, for example, if you've improved your skills by 100%, in a typical company, the only way you would be compensated for that is you have to leave. At Netflix, they're like, well, no, you're 100% more valuable. We'll pay you 100% more. It's just a different way of looking at the question. So I think it's really what kind of culture, what kind of forward-looking thing do you want to create? And do people have a feeling of belonging, a feeling of being treated with dignity, a feeling of being respected? Those are the things that we know. I mean, statistically, we know this. Those lead to greater customer satisfaction, greater net promoter scores, greater penetration of wallet, and.
Are these businesses encouraged, like you talk about the end of competitive advantage as an organization, meaning there's a short window, you have to continue to innovate. Would you say that those same rules apply for you as a leader, as an employee? Mm-hmm. Do you have to sort of accept that, okay, I'm a great X, but my window of opportunity is quite small, and I'm going to have to keep innovating myself to be part of these businesses? Is that how things are becoming as well?
Yeah. And I think a great book on this is Whitney Johnson's book on driving up, it's called Disrupt Yourself. And she talks about personal S-curves, where in the beginning of a new job, right, you're obviously not going to know what you're doing because it's new. And so you'll have all this learning to do and these fits and starts, and it feels like, oh my God, this feels terrible. Then you start to learn, right? You go up the S-curve, and then you get to this critical place where you're there. It's great. It's easy, but this is going to be the plateau you're on unless you make a change to sort of take a step into something unknown and start a new S-curve. And the tricky thing about this is the J-curve in the middle, where, you're at the top of your game on one thing, and now you're going to have to go and learn something new. And by definition, you're not going to be at the top of your game in that second thing. But I think more and more people are coming to realize that that's the way careers are looking now. I call this the tour of duty career environment, after Reid Hoffman and Chris Ye's book, The Alliance. And what they talk about is this idea that people will have permanent careers with one organization. That's not really the way things are working now, that instead what we've got is alliance relationships. So I bring you as my employer the best that I have and the deepest commitment and the whatever over the course of this tour of duty we've signed up for. And at the end of it, we may decide, it's going to change. And it doesn't have to mean hurt feelings or negative interpersonal relationships. I mean, there are stories about people that have worked with a company, left the company, come back, left, come back, left, come back, 10 times, 12 times. We hear a lot of that now. And so I think it's useful to be thinking of these things in terms of your networks. And one of the things I would observe is that our interpersonal networks are a lot more stable than many of our corporate relationships are. So the fact that I'm, part of an academic network, for instance, might mean much more to me than the fact that I happen to be affiliated with this or that university at any particular point in time.
I guess it's, the message I've got is that there's no, we're in a world where it's extremely transient. Everything's changing, and you need to get really, really comfortable with a high level of change and to be able to sort of innovate at the same time.
Let me add on that.
Interesting. So
I do think, though, that people don't do well in a big vacuum with endless uncertainty. So you do need to carve out places where there's stability for yourself. So maybe it's a set of associations, maybe it's a group of friends, maybe it's, a certain hobby or something that fascinates you. But I think it's great to have this change and this change openness. But I think most of us need something to hang on to that's a little more stable. So find that source of stability and then you can experiment out from that.
So Rita, you've got some fantastic books. Where can people find more about you? Maybe you can talk about your podcast and a few other things that you've got going on for people who want to sort of go a little bit deeper in this subject.
So the easiest central location to find things is ritamcgrath.com. That's my website. And I do a weekly Friday fireside chat with people who I think are fascinating, interesting, unusual, and intriguing. And that's available both in podcast form and as a YouTube video. You can find them on my YouTube channel. Then in terms of books, Seeing Around Corners is my 5th book. You can definitely look up all the others. And I am a lot on podcasts like this, so you'll find me at various places across the internet. And then at Columbia, I teach courses in strategy under times of uncertainty, as well as a wonderful course on women in leadership.
Fantastic. Well, I definitely recommend checking out the Seeing Around Corners book, because there's quite a lot that we've still not had chance to go into, but you can get the book and read it. There's some really great ideas and things to sort of, I guess, absorb into what you're doing, because it is a tough time. But I think, certainly after listening and reading a lot about you, it kind of, I guess it just changes your mindset, and it's, sometimes it's very easy, even pre-pandemic, you kind of get stuck into this kind of box. And even though, I always like to think I'm an out of the box thinker, but sometimes it takes an idea to get you to realize, look, you're still in a box, and you need to kind of come at it from a very different angle. So I think if anyone's sort of in that position where they can't see the wood for the trees, then, check some of this stuff out, because it's definitely been very beneficial to me. So final question then, Rita. Escape Your Limits is about escaping what you've believed is impossible and gone on to make it possible. What would be an example of escaping your own personal limits?
Well, when I first started my PhD, which was in management, and I had been a manager for about 8 years, and I thought, oh, I must know a thing or two about management. Wrong. And so when I first started, it was an awful year. And, I didn't know how to read an academic article. I didn't know what a theory was. I didn't know how to function. And I thought, this is just never going to be me. But I'd made my choice, so I persevered. And through a lot of hard work and a lot of support from some people that really cared, got past that and have really enjoyed a thriving life in academia. But it sure didn't start out that way.
Fantastic. Well, look, Rita, thank you very much for your time today. Wish you success in everything that you're doing, and maybe one day we can meet face to face at some point.
Work out
when this is all over.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, then please go over to iTunes and subscribe to the Escape Your Limits podcast. Leave a review, leave a comment. It really would help us a lot to continue to keep these going.